Good morning or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online. Today is Wednesday, April 8th, 2020, and we're back after about a week, 8 days since we were last together for the Broadband Breakfast live online. Thank you so much for sticking with us, coming back. We obviously plan to do this going forward every week. A little bit more relaxed is probably the wrong word, a little more manageable pace than what we were doing before when we had every day from Monday to Friday. But we learned a lot from those first 12 episodes that we sponsored or hosted. And we're really grateful now for the new set of topics we'll be discussing going forward. Today, we're going to talk about telehealth and specifically what telehealth can do, what it can't do, and how it can assist in the remedies, the solutions, solving some of the problems that have been confronted, that we were confronted by the coronavirus pandemic. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say a couple of words and then introduce Bob Balance, who will speak to us a little bit about a tool that he's created and that he's recently updated to include some data about the coronavirus. But again, first, during the month of March, we were just so focused, not us particularly, but the country and the world, on just grasping the enormity of what we were dealing with. And obviously, it continues to be a crisis, a very major disruption, and a true pandemic that none of us have ever seen, nor our parents or perhaps our grandparents. But as we've gone from the situation where we followed everything super closely to today, where we're probably taking a little more time, being a little more careful. And I thought I would share this graphic here for everyone to see. This is time spent looking at exponential graphs, January, February, and March. And so, obviously we all went up quite a bit last month looking at these exponential graphs, and hopefully April will show a little leveling off of that trend. I am also just cognizant that America is very much at the core of this pandemic right now. Just before we went live, 397,754 cases in the country, which is, almost a quarter of the worldwide total, and 12,956 deaths, which is a little less than that, about a seventh of the 83,000 some deaths. So this is a true crisis that we're all trying to deal with, and our little piece of the world in broadband may not be the core, but it is very much part of the solution. And that's what we really hope to talk about just now with our guests. But let's start with Bob Balance. Bob, say just a few words about yourself and what internet infrastructure is all about before we flip over to the slides that I have that you've prepared.
Absolutely, I'd be delighted to. I got started on this project several years ago. I was actually on an appointment in Washington, D.C. with NTIA doing analysis of broadband data. And when I got done with that appointment, I couldn't let go of the problem. And broadband is multifaceted. We like to think of it as infrastructure where it's routers and fiber and satellites, but it's really all those things and the digital skills to use it. And so as a result, I've pulled together a tool which is free. We'll talk about it a little bit in a moment, and you'll have a URL at the end of that set of screenshots that pulls together data from a variety of sources and really localizes it to the place you're interested in, whether it's your town or your county or your school district. I'm delighted to be on a panel with Tyler from Broadband Now, because they do absolutely wonderful work. This tool is a companion in some ways, a complementary tool to Broadband Now. And I'm also cognizant that I'm between you and a panel of experts about telehealth and telemedicine. So let's take a look at the i3 Connectivity Explorer just for a second. And
Great.
then I want to talk about what we've added to it recently.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. This again is, and by the way, for those of you who are watching from the broadbandbreakfast.com website, you should be on the page where you have resources, including other panelist resources. We've got a report from Tyler Cooper of Broadband Now, but we've also got this link here that I'm about to demonstrate. So let's go ahead and share this. And I'm going to make it full screen here. And Bob, I'm kind of blind here because I'm just demonstrating what you've
okay.
got. You just tell me what to do, and I will
go full screen and hit next.
Very good. Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Yep. Next. What I discovered in looking at this data is that we talk about mapping, and mapping comes with cardinal points. And for me, the cardinal points are really what are shown on this graphic. It's demographics, income, background, cultural activities, adoption and use information, how many people have devices in the home, and then we get to provider data and speed. And people usually start with the FCC data, and we all know that that's problematic. And then they look at speed test data, whether it's Ookla or MLab. And as I say, if you look down into the left on this chart, the speed tests and the provider data gets you into broadband planning. And up and to the right are the territories of digital equity. And in the terms of Theodore Holm Nelson, who really invented this idea of hypertext, these places are intertwinkled. People who start looking at digital equity issues suddenly find themselves worrying about speeds and feeds. People worried about speeds and feeds in order to promote a new development or to get a grant, whether it's from the government or in a public-private partnership, are suddenly dealing with the demographics and adoption and use issues. So next slide, please. So what I've done in the i3 Connectivity Explorer is to take a variety of data sets that are associated with the cardinal points. They're all national level, but I try to localize them down to the places we live, to our school districts, to our towns, to our counties, to our county subdivisions, and look at a little broader scope than the address level scope, but also not at the national level. As Penny Pritzker, who used to be the Secretary of Commerce, used to say, nobody's really interested in the average temperature in America today. You want to know what it's like outside or what it's like outside for your friends and relatives. So I take the cardinal points, I bring in US Census data from the American Community Survey, I bring in FCC data, I bring in the National Center for Educational Statistics data, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, adoption and use data, USDA county data for economics, like I mentioned, FCC, ecoregions, and also the MLab speed tests, so that you can bring all of these together and start to look at what's going on in your community. And there's always unexplored data sets that are not on my map. So next slide. I got a call as the pandemic was breaking out from a friend of mine at the Department of Education. And the question was basically, which school districts are most in need of intervention or investment right now? My local state coordinator here in New Mexico had Wi-Fi hotspots to give out. Which school district should they target? And long-term, as we look at the plans coming through Congress, where do we need to invest? And so rather than a school district by school district view, I've pulled together two new statewide views for each state that give you a table, so you can look at all of your school districts in context, and also a map. And on that table includes some of the key indicators: enrollment, number of students under 18 who don't have a computer in the home or don't have a broadband connection. But also, I'm using the digital distress indicator that came out of Purdue and Roberto Gallardo's work. And you can rank school districts really from 0 to 100, from least in need to most in need. And it's scale independent. So the largest districts don't always come up to the top, even though they affect the most students. But what's here is that all of the school districts outside of the charter districts, because I don't have full data on charter districts, show up in this table. So every school district has a voice. This table is available. It's under the statewide menu in the tool. It scrolls up and down and left and right, and you can sort on any of these indicators. If you go to the next slide, please. The DDI, the Digital Distress Indicator, is also put on a state map so that you can browse around, see in your state what's going on. And when this comes back to rural telehealth, while I don't have county data yet, if you know where your clinics are and what school districts they're serving, this actually will act as a proxy for how well connected the people living in those areas are. And of course, if you go to the next slide, you can drill down into any individual district and see the district mapped with ACS internet subscription data, devices in the home data, speed test data, and all the other things that the tool has had and is up and available for you to make use of. So connecting it back to telemedicine, the school districts become a proxy, but it starts to give you a view of where in the state you might want to make your investments. So I think there's one more slide. And this is it. I was blessed by giving a workshop in Oregon many months ago. And the fortune at the table was put the data you've discovered to beneficial use. This is something I hope everybody will do. If you jump on the tool, this is in the notes. And that being said, if there are any questions, I'll take them. Or Drew, anything from you? And otherwise, we can turn over to the panel.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for a great presentation. Let me just ask a couple quick questions before we go to our panel. You know, you and I talked obviously about 2 weeks ago about you know, what modifications you made to internet is infrastructure and to this tool. Could you speak about what's on the menu for teleeducation, right? So like, what's the value of the school districts at this moment that the schools are kind of still in a bit of a scramble mode?
They really are. So I talk with people in the education sector, and especially, you know, a lot of this comes out through the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. They're scrambling, and you know, today there was a request on another mailing list saying, well, where can my city get 15,000 Chromebooks? Right now we're busy working on personal protective equipment and ventilators, but Chromebooks or Wi-Fi hotspots are in deep demand for school districts all across America. And then the question is, how do you allocate them? Because they're in short supply. And we're switching over to a high degree of remote education. School districts are trying to move to broadband to deliver classes. Some schools, districts have said, we're not going to do this because we have too many disadvantaged students. And if we move to simply remote education, it just exacerbates the problem of, for instance, the screenshot I showed you was a little school district in Arizona. It's at the top of the DDI distress list. It happens to be elementary, but I think about 60% of the students either don't have a computer or don't have a broadband connection.
Yeah, yeah.
And how do you deliver education in that milieu? And for the aging population and everybody at home, how do you deliver telemedicine if you're not connected?
Great. Great. Well, thank you again. This has been an awesome introduction, even though it's not necessarily directly connected to telehealth. Since we're doing this on a weekly basis, Broadband Breakfast Live online every Wednesday at noon, we hope to be able to feature kind of news and snippets and updates. And we didn't want to wait until we got to another session on education or data to include you. So thank you very much. Now,
Thank
I do
you.
want to and stick around here because we're going to go ahead and have you in the panel here with the rest. But I also want to invite our audience. Thank you again for coming back to us and following us. If you're watching on one of our social channels, just type a note in there, right? Say, so and so from such and such a place. And if you've got a question about telehealth, go ahead and pop that in there, and we'll put it on the screen. If you're watching on Broadband Breakfast, you can tweet to Broadband Live, hashtag Broadband Live. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'll put them up in the order that they'll be speaking. We have kind of right around the clock here on our program. We have Kim Almquist. Is that how you say it?
Yes, Almquist.
Kim is a DNP, a family nurse practitioner in Wilson, North Carolina, and serves the Wilson County Health Department with 2 school-based health clinics. So we're really looking forward to her kicking us off and talking about what's going on in your world with telehealth, the coronavirus, and other matters. Craig Settles, who assists municipalities and co-ops to plan telehealth and broadband strategies. Settles was saved by a stroke, or I should say, through telehealth, he was saved from a stroke. And so Craig will be able to tell us a little bit about his experience and what he's done in the telehealth world since then. And then Tyler Cooper is the editor-in-chief of Broadband Now, and he's just published a report on telehealth, which is why we wanted to have him back on the program. He was on one of our previous ones. Thank you. And the link is in the bottom of the page if you're watching on Broadband Breakfast. So thank you to Jolly in New York for saying hello. That's what we want. Let's go ahead and turn to you, Kim. Tell us a little bit about what the situation is like in your experience and what telehealth, the role telehealth plays in the solution here.
Sure. I'll give a little bit of a background. I was located in 2 school-based health centers in Wilson County prior to the coronavirus closing our schools. I served a high school and a middle school. I also provided services to a college there in Wilson County. I used telehealth when I was located in one of the rural, say at the high school. I would use telehealth to see patients both at the college and the middle school during the same day. So with that experience, a registered nurse was there running the equipment. I had a digital stethoscope, otoscope, ophthalmoscope, where I could actually see and hear patient heart sounds, lung sounds, and look in the ears, eyes, nose, and throat for assessments. Once the schools were closed, I'm now based at home. I have been into the health department working some, but primarily I see most of my patients through telehealth. Once the HIPAA restrictions were relaxed, I can see patients over Zoom, WebEx, or FaceTime. FaceTime has been my most popular option for my patients that I've been seeing. And of course, sometimes with the limitations of those devices, I have to refer them into the health department to see another nurse practitioner because I can't hear their heart or lung sounds. But I would say about 90% of the visits are able to be completed through telehealth while I'm working remotely in my home, and the patient is also in their home.
So you just described a kind of a digital stethoscope. Many of our watchers and myself may not be familiar with that medical tool. How does that work exactly? How long has it been in operation? And talk about the broadband that's required to make that work.
Well, I don't really know much about the technology side of the broadband. I know in Wilson we have Green Light, which is superior. It's an excellent connection. I guess I can say the name of the device is TitoCare that I use, and it's actually connected through an iPad. but it is a stethoscope that the nurse I direct from my computer on my end, and the nurse attaches either stethoscope, ophthalmoscope, or otoscope. Otoscope, you look in the ear, so that I can see and hear everything that I would see in a face-to-face visit with a patient. I just can't obviously palpate or touch the patient. Sometimes I do have to get the nurse to say, touch the patient or move the computer or the device so I can see better, but it's all remote. And that device does require a registered nurse to run it.
Okay. Well, you have a
Sorry, I have
photobombing your
yeah.
picture. One of our early discussions, we discussed this, that look, there may be glitches, there may be problems. You just have to kind of lower your standards, right? Be prepared for the unexpected. Thank you, Lisa, for checking in. So one more specific question for you, Kim, before we go to
Sure.
Craig, and that is, so in some of our early reporting on broadbandbreakfast.com about the coronavirus and its impact, we immediately thought, okay, telemedicine, what role will telehealth and telemedicine play? And after some initial digging, well, it doesn't really impact, because, a lot of the diagnosis and treatment of this COVID-19 is very much an in-person thing. But what has happened, and I've certainly experienced this over the past month, is that everything else is becoming telemedicine, right? Because they want everyone else to stay out of the way, stay out of the clinics. And so I've had doctor's appointments for the very first time over the phone over the past, right? And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on both the specifics of COVID-19 and telehealth, and in generally what's happening in the field of medicine over the past month.
Sure. And I can only speak from my own experience. But I do see telehealth growing because of COVID-19. I know personally, my daughter receives occupational therapy, speech therapy, and she's doing all of that on telehealth. The providers are able to bill, the providers are able to see her. Actually, she's getting more services now than she did before, because I'm not having to take off from work and drive her into Raleigh, which is a good hour drive. We can do those services right in the comfort of our own home. I'll also say for the Wilson County Health Department, we are looking into more platforms so that we can continue and do more telemedicine. I have patients reach out to me every day for a scheduled follow-up visit, and they're like, I don't want to come into the clinic because I don't want to leave my home. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want to risk the chance of catching COVID. So we are doing a lot of follow-up visits on telehealth, which is great. The challenges lie when a patient is on a blood pressure medicine and I need to check their labs, or I need to know what their blood pressure is from their own home without certain devices. I'm not able to check their blood pressure or to, obviously draw labs. So, but some things, like I had a patient yesterday that had a rash, and I was able to look at that rash over the internet and diagnose and call in medications. So that patient never had to leave their home. So I think that as patients and the public becomes more knowledgeable about telehealth, it hopefully will become an expectation in the future. Just from an economical standpoint, patients not having to take off work to drive 2 hours to see a specialist, patients not having to take off just to come in and see their primary care provider for simple follow-ups that can be done over the internet. So I'm hoping it's a launching pad for telehealth. I'm excited.
And thank you for that great summary and great description. Craig, let's turn to you and tell us a little bit about your experience with telehealth and some of the observations you've had on the role telehealth has in the kind of response to the coronavirus and COVID-19.
Okay, I'll just say right now, I'll be taking the full 10 minutes. Telehealth started as telemedicine. It was very simple. I would call it limited to a certain point, right? You would allow people to, track their medication. You'd be able to remind people of taking their medication. You could do a lot of administrative details and that type of thing. I mean, telehealth has been around since the 90s. So as a result, I mean, this started somewhat simply. 5-6 years ago, people started looking at the whole range of everything that you can use telehealth for. So now we're looking at what I call not what the industry calls the continuum of care. Everything that goes on medically to get a person better, right? So very simple continuum of care. I have a cold. I call in the doctor through telehealth. They give me some meds or prescribe certain medication and so forth. A couple of days later, you check your temperature and this and the other, and you're better, right? So it's a very simple continuum of care, right? In a more advanced situation, right? We'll take the stroke that I had 5 years ago, right? There is the initial episode and trying to get me to a hospital so that I could be treated and started on the regimen of medicine to make sure that I didn't get the situation didn't get worse, right? And then you move to rehab facility, and there are various things. There's rehab of the body, the mind, the speech, and so forth, right? All of those things you can facilitate with broadband in one way or another, right? You have the recovery. Then you have some of the medical or the mental health issues, being laid up and so forth. So that becomes part of the continuum, right? So telehealth is basically using broadband for everything that is available to make the patient better. Now, some aspects of it, you can't do surgery online, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
look at this COVID situation, right? Really, the thing that telehealth can intervene is the monitoring aspect, right? Because the the swab to figure out if you have the virus, right? That's very hands-on, and you can't automate that process, right? You can later, when the person's been diagnosed, you can have that person have their heart and their lungs checked with the devices that Kim was talking about, but that's pretty much it. Now, the whole range of other things that you can use telehealth for, well, that's the value of um, telehealth in this current crisis, right? I can, have a simple doctor's appointment online, right? If I had a stroke, we won't tempt that fate, but if you have a serious kind of situation, right? They have telehealth in the ambulances, right?
yeah.
So I can have all of my stats uh, sent over to the hospital before I even leave my house, right? So there's all these different types of medical treatments that telehealth can affect.
Right.
Now, the
Let me
thing,
cut in, Craig,
sure.
and ask you a question. Then you build on this too. But where did you see the most progress in telehealth prior to the kind of the centrality of the coronavirus and COVID-19? What areas, what fields of medicine and healthcare did you see the most advances? Were we having the most progress?
I would say, unbeknownst to most people, there's been a lot of advancements in various aspects of of medicine, right? So the most um, uh, known of the telehealth, why do you use it? Is where you get the doctor checkup and you do it from your home or your office, right? That's very popular. Everybody can understand it. It makes sense, right? The Fitbit craze. Everybody understands that there's a device that you strap on your arm and you get all your readings from your activity, right? And it's all categorized and chronic. It's you have a God, what's the word I'm looking for? You have the ability to keep track of all of your advancements as you get more fit, right? So that's the most popular, right? But in reality, you have telestroke, you have ICUs where the staff in one place may be monitoring 6 or 7 different ICU units, right? You have mental health is become popular because I don't have to worry who's going to see me going to my shrink's office. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal. But now I go online, right? Number one, if I'm in the rural area, I don't have to drive 4 hours because there aren't a lot of psychiatrists in the rural areas, right? So you get distance benefit, but you also, like I said, you don't have like who's watching who kind of thing, right? And people in different rural areas have talked very specifically about the benefit of having a anonymous interactions with certain types of medical professionals, right? You have in Chattanooga, one of their famous stories is a radiologist who pulled together all these other radiologists in Chattanooga, and they have the gig network, and so they can do all kinds of radiology services um, uh, basically from their home. And they can do more of them, and they can do it in less time. So there's a huge amount of dollar savings, right? So you have that whole area of that. There are things uh, that we're looking at in theoretic terms, right? If I have a replaced hip, I can with AI, help me here.
Artificial intelligence, yeah.
Yes, thank you, thank you. So I can put the device on, and then my therapist could have a device, and they can tell you, okay, you need to move your leg about 2 centimeters, right? So it's that level of detail of observation,
Right.
and then being able to facilitate that care is intense. So it's the question is valid, but I would say there's a public face of telehealth before we got to the whole COVID issue.
Yeah.
And then we have all of these other disciplines, medical disciplines, that are looking at how can they use broadband and other technologies and electronics to affect the continuum of care.
Okay, let's broaden the conversation here. We've had some great perspectives from a practitioner and from an expert in the field, Craig, as well as someone who's kind of benefited from this. I want to talk now about the infrastructure itself. And Tyler, if you could speak a little bit about your recent report on this very subject and what you kind of learned that maybe was new that you didn't know, but then how that ties into these kinds of things that Kim and Craig have been talking about, how they're going to come to be.
Absolutely. First off, yeah, thank you, Craig and Kim. Great to hear both your perspectives. Really, really interesting insight into things that I write about from afar. So very good to have the perspective. And thank you, Bob, as well, for the kind words. And it was a really interesting presentation. Looking forward to checking out the tool. So at Broadband Now, we talk quite a bit about digital equity and closing the digital divide. And really our main goal, especially with Broadband Now research, is to quantify and understand the digital divide. And right now we have this sort of mass shift we're all experiencing where, so much of work and learning is in the home. So obviously we have more demand for adequate broadband, I guess we would say, at least adequate, hopefully robust broadband in the home than ever before. And telehealth it's been fascinating because probably all of us here on this panel have been very familiar with telehealth for a long time now. We're aware of the benefits. We're aware of how great it can be for folks who don't have any other options. But right now, for the first time, it's also being thrust into the public consciousness, right? We have this huge surge in medical demand all of a sudden. In many areas, the demand is broaching up against capacity. Capacity is, we get pretty close to capacity on a good day, as I understand. So this is a very serious situation. So serious as it relates to telehealth that in 2018, I believe, the American Medical Informatics Association wrote a letter urging the FCC to designate broadband access as a social determinant of health. And so essentially it just means that, broadband access is a structural factor that determines health outcomes or at least impacts them. And so over the past couple of weeks, we've been doing lots of monitoring of U.S. cities and how the networks are performing in these areas and if we're seeing degradations and things of that nature. But we've also conducted a survey over the last several weeks asking folks around the country, what's your relationship to telehealth? Is it something that is offered in your area? Have you used it? Has your medical routine been disrupted by this virus? And, I wish I could say the results are surprising. They're not. And in that way, they're sort of disappointing. But, over half of the Americans we surveyed, so about 53%, indicated that they or their medical provider had canceled or rescheduled an appointment due to the pandemic over the past 4 weeks. So they've had an appointment either canceled on them. And this is non-COVID-19 appointments, right? This is just medical checkups, prescription renewals, all the different things that you would do at your primary care doctor. Of those that had canceled, we found that only just over half, again, 54% said that their primary care provider even offers any sort of telehealth services whatsoever, whether that's online prescription renewal or full-on consultations. And so, so half of the people that we surveyed said they have access. So that's all well and good. Well, it's really not all well and good, but that's interesting data. What we found, however, and so another thing we look at a lot is sort of access at the national level. And currently the FCC estimates that 21.3 million Americans do not have access to a broadband connection at home. So they don't have access to a single wired connection that meets the federal definition of 25 megabits per second download speeds and 3 megabits per second upload speeds. Well, Broadband Now published our own study in February, sort of looking into the source of truth for that information, which is the FCC's 477, which, as Bob pointed out, has lots of fun flaws, which are well known. And we found that the number may actually be closer to double. It could be close as much as 42 million Americans who don't have access to broadband. And that's a problem, when we don't have a pandemic on our hands for a litany of reasons. We have a huge digital divide that needs to be accounted for. It needs to be taken care of. But right now, we're sort of seeing the ugly truth of this in the telehealth field, or really in the healthcare field in general, because as my panelists have pointed out, this can be so useful for people across the country for a wide degree of reasons. And many of those reasons, people in rural areas really need them the most. They may live further from a large hospital. They may have more distance to travel to just do really basic stuff like fill prescriptions or get them renewed, and there's so many different things that make the healthcare experience more disparate and challenging in rural areas.
Yeah.
And,
I've got a couple questions, but let's go ahead and add Bob Balance back into the discussion here. Thank you, Bob. So question for kind of both Tyler and Bob. What are some of the things that you've observed, to the extent we know this now, right? But is there any particular bandwidth thresholds that make sense? And I guess actually Kim and Craig as well, if you have thoughts on this, are there particular benchmarks that kind of need to be there in order to do certain types of telehealth applications, either in your study, Tyler, that you did, or Bob, in kind of the work you're doing? And by the way, we got a tweet from Karen Archer Perry thanking broadband breakfast, but also internet, the i3 Connect Explorer. And she says that she wanted to reinforce how i3connect.org puts people in charge of their own data. So maybe you could kind of speak to that after you address it, Bob. But Tyler and Bob, you first, but also open it to everyone.
Yeah, Bob, if you have thoughts, feel free.
You know, I'm gonna walk around that question a little bit, because I think that what we're seeing is, let's go back to Craig's radiology example. You know, we're going to push more bits both directions, and the asymmetry of 25 down and 3 up works not so well when everybody is doing remote education, remote teleconferencing. I'm being very careful because my wife is in the next room, probably also on a video conference, and we push those limitations. And in the rural areas, like Tyler was talking about, the connectivity gets even worse. So we need to be building our networks, whether it's to the Benton Institute's 100 down, 100 up, or something more symmetric, to build networks that will scale to the telehealth applications that are in the pipeline. You know, we're seeing 4K and now 8K video, and most of us can't produce that, let alone consume it. And as the applications get richer, the infrastructure, the core, has got to be able to handle all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to add on to that, I spoke with several telehealth providers directly for my piece, and you know, many of them said that their platforms are very variable and flexible. So you know, there's a sliding scale of quality that they can obviously adapt to as needed. So many of them said that they can operate on a connection as little as 3 down, 1 up. But they said that obviously, as we all know, video quality will suffer at that level. So you're sort of precluded from doing certain things you might only be able to do with a higher quality connection. Not only that, but for some of the more robust applications we're talking about, like real-time monitoring and things of that nature, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because you need a better connection on the user's end, but you also need the connection on the clinic's end to be able to handle real-time monitoring and video feeds across, at scale, really, for the local area. So that's another sort of less talked about issue on this this sort of chain as well.
And I'm glad you went there, Tyler, because there's another thought that I want to put into the discussion. I live in New Mexico, which is tremendously rural, and I am in a family of healthcare providers and in a neighborhood of healthcare providers. And what I know, and this is anecdotal because I would love to have the data and I don't have it yet, the clinics themselves in rural areas, the hospitals and clinics, don't have good connectivity out to the larger population areas. So if they need to run a test and, if they need to do a radiography test and ship it to a tier 2 or tier 3 hospital, they have crummy connections. They also have crummy connections going out to their patients, which is what we talk about. And with all due respect to Commissioner Rosenworcel, can we call this the home care gap? People in their homes don't have access to the broadband they need to do their telemedicine. And the third piece of the arc is what we've seen in education, which is we've taken teachers and made them into technical support people for their students as they get devices and need to know how to use them. What's this going to do to our medical practices? Will people like Kim now have to spend time working with one of their patients to get monitoring set up? And can you bill for that? Or is this just an additional load to get everybody connected until we get all of the connectivity and devices and skills and access that we need?
Kim, in terms of the work you do, what specifics have you been given, or do you notice in terms of, at what point you cannot do you cannot run the Tido Care? Is that what it's called? Could you just speak to the bandwidth needs to run your work?
I have no idea. Craig may know because he is familiar with Wilson, North Carolina, but I will tell you that initially when I started Tido Care, I was in a very rural area in Wilson County, and it wouldn't work. We had to get our own broadband connection from Greenlight. We could not piggyback off of the school's network because it was so slow that I would say something to a patient, ask a question regarding their history and their history, and it would take so much of a delay. And then when I went to do an assessment, it was pixelated. So I would hear a heartbeat, and then 2 minutes later, the nurse would remove the stethoscope, and I'm still hearing heartbeats. So I know we did have to connect with Greenlight. Craig, do you know? I don't know anything about I just take care of patients. I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I'd like to answer that in a different way. So there are two things that we need to address, right? One is on the telehealth side, and to a certain extent on the broadband side, right? Is this understanding or lack of understanding of the difference between speed and capacity, right? Telehealth vendors are trying to make their software and their programs take as much or less little space as possible. But the problem is the capacity. Like, what do you have at the neighborhood level that allows or not allows people to get that that heartbeat or what have you, right? So we need to start looking at are we addressing speed or capacity or both? And until we do, we're going to have some delays. The second part of this issue, right? I don't think a lot of people realize that telehealth has been handcuffed by federal regulations. Before COVID, right, you'd have to go from your home to a medical facility and from there actually get your health care. Well, then why the hell am I going all that way? I mean, that's what the benefit of telehealth is supposed to be. And so the rules that have been lifted for the COVID thing, those need to be permanent. And everybody who cares about this issue needs to lobby at the state level and the federal level. And some of these other issues about speed and do you have access in different communities and so forth, it kind of comes down to those questions of regs and understanding the nature of broadband and speed versus capacity.
Let me just jump in on that, Craig. So you're identifying both some issues about reimbursement for different processes that are telehealth, and perhaps you could elucidate, or others could elucidate on that. But I also want to mention, and we haven't yet covered this here, but as part of the CARES Act that passed about 2.5 weeks ago, or maybe just 2 weeks ago, the federal government, of course, did many steps to address the coronavirus crisis. But one of them was adding 200 million, small number relatively, to telemedicine and telehealth activities. And the FCC, and we reported this on Broadband Breakfast, has put out a process for telehealth funds being able to receive up to 1 million in aid per applicants to a variety of institutions, post-secondary educational institutions, community health centers, local health departments. And on top of that 200 million, the FCC is kind of emphasizing the Connected Care pilot, a little bit longer program, but less money, 100 million. And that program is a part of other FCC activities. So I just wanted to get those out there because I don't know whether any of you all see those as being central or important to addressing telehealth solutions to the coronavirus crisis. But I wanted to at least raise those and also to highlight this regulatory issue Craig mentioned.
I have a point. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but
no, go for it.
I was talking to someone earlier this week, and I said, we have all this money coming out, right, from the FCC and so forth, and I am really worried that this will be not utilized in the best way, right? Because if you are the grantor of all these funds, but you don't understand the particulars of telehealth and the particulars of the problem, right? Which I feel like a lot of bureaucrats don't understand, right? How do they know if candidate B or A actually has a program that'll work, right? I think there's a knowledge gap among the people who fund all these programs. And we're talking about rural healthcare, E-rate, all these FCC telehealth programs and so forth. Those people don't understand. Hell, I've been spending for like the last 2.5 years, and there's a lot of stuff to know, and it affects how you solve these different problems. And I think right now we're like rolling out money, which is good, but I don't think we're rolling out knowledge on the part of the granting of facilities, and this is going to bite us in the butt later, I think.
No, good thoughts. Let me ask you, Kim, about some of your thoughts on the sort of the reimbursement, the financial aspects of telehealth and telemedicine.
Sure. It's been approximately 30 days now since the regulations have been relaxed. You can do a telehealth visit now without the platform being HIPAA compliant, which allows many patients to call in over the phone, over FaceTime or Zoom, or WebEx, whatever platform the provider's using, and the provider or agency is getting reimbursed the same rate as an in-office visit. Most big insurance companies, I'll speak to Blue Cross and Blue Shield, they are going by the month. So right now we might have 30 more days of it, and then they will make those decisions moving forward. But as Craig mentioned, being advocates and having these rules and regulations stay in place indefinitely will expand telehealth, because as providers, or as any provider need, we have to be reimbursed. So if those regulations hadn't been relaxed, I wouldn't be able to provide telehealth right now.
Well, that's great to hear about that experience there. Bob, would you care to comment on the issue of connectivity and symmetrical connectivity?
Yeah, thank you. Two thoughts on this. One is the, I was going to say recent report, but I think it was November, from the Benton Foundation by Jonathan Salet, talking about what future networks need to look like and what we should be building for, talking about more aspirational goals, and especially with respect to symmetry. And a second one is a comment that I got from a friend of mine, Patty Snyder, who is a USDA rural development expert. And she reframed it not as download and upload, but as consumption and productivity. Download speeds are all about consumption. How soon can I get something into my house? Upload speeds and upload capacity, and I think Craig is exactly right about that, is all about production. Whether you're a dairy and you need to ship your dairy production records every day at 5 a.m. so that you can get your milk to market, which has been an issue in North Carolina, or you can ship your telehealth, telemedicine, daily evaluation back to the clinic, or your radiography records. So it's not just down and up. It really is consumption and production. And as we come out of this crisis and, the world is refolding itself in an amazing way, where do we want to set the slider between those two?
Yeah. Tyler, I'd love your thoughts based on your research, not just telehealth, but other issues involving broadband.
Yeah, well, I know we're kind of coming up on the end here, so I'll just kind of reinforce this. When we're talking higher level or more aspirational, rural areas have the lowest patient to primary care physician ratio in the United States, and that should come as no surprise. But a study characterized, I believe, 75% of rural counties as being medically underserved. I found that 166 counties, each comprised of 10,000 or more residents, had no primary care physician whatsoever. These are just stats this is the normal for rural folks all around the nation, and in so many different parts. And I think it's easy to sit here and talk in the abstract about, hey, this is what's working, this is what's not, this is what we need to do to get broadband to Americans, this is what we need to do to ease regulations on telehealth services. But we also need to remember that, I mean, this is real life, right? We have this situation playing out right now. It's unprecedented. We have people who rely on the healthcare system for life-threatening needs that are outside of this virus. And right now, we may be pushing some of them into the fringes, especially in rural areas. So, yeah, I mean, again, I would just say that, it sounds like I really appreciate all the perspectives on the panel today, because it's helped me in my thinking about how we sort of discuss this going forward. There's no one solution here. We need to wire America. We need to put the regulations in place to make sure this is ubiquitous for folks in areas that do have connectivity. But yeah, I mean, again, it's going to take a lot more than a couple, 100 million here or 200 million there to do this. Obviously that, as many of us know, is sort of like throwing a pebble at a tidal wave when it comes to actually, wiring America. So there's a lot that needs to be done.
There's kind of both a short-term issue and a long-term issue, right? And one of the very first Broadband Breakfast live online events we had 2 or 3 weeks ago, we actually had a discussion about emergency measures that the FCC could and should take, and this included a discussion about making sure that people knew that, like, for example, data caps, right? It was trying to get get rid of the data caps, at least on a temporary basis, because people are not using their data plans and they're going out to places to find out about, things, testing or other things, when they just need to rely more online. And so kind of that's a sort of an example of a short-term issue. But then the long-term issue is kind of, Bob and others who've talked about making sure the connectivity we're building is going to last for the long term. And we had a great comment from Jolly. I'll put it back up here. He said, the silver lining of all this is that it is exposing the gaps. And that's 100% true. We're definitely seeing gaps be exposed. We do have another question here from Seth Johnson, general purpose platform with heterogeneous uses, not a set of efficient services via established players. And I think he's addressing some of the points you were making there about consumption and production. So let any of you reply to this. But let's actually do a round. Go from Kim, Craig, Tyler, and Bob. Any final thoughts on, with that frame in mind, short-term and long-term fixes and solutions to making sure we can use telehealth solutions going forward? Go ahead, Kim. We'll start with you on final thoughts.
Sure. Just as we've all know, for me, it's the continuing with the reimbursement, making sure that we are able to bill fully for all of our telehealth visits. But on the flip side, making sure all of our patients can use telehealth and can utilize those services, even in rural North Carolina and across the country. So I think we do have a lot of work to be done. I think hopefully COVID will be the silver lining will be that we can utilize more telehealth, and it will grow.
Excellent. Craig, what are some of the thoughts you have on short-term and long-term?
I would say that short-term or maybe long-term, we've got to keep these relaxing of the rules that govern telehealth in place. In my last point, in rural New York, they have doctors who will not use telehealth because the state legislature and the insurance companies have cuffed them and basically said, we will only give you 50% of your time will be reimbursed, right? But the doctor still has to do that work. And so if you're going to take that money away, you'll never get telehealth. And I'm a big advocate of getting the legislators the hell out of the way and understand we need to change our approach to this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Tyler, what are some final thoughts that you have?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, we're covering a lot of bases here. At Broadband Now, we're big fans of anything that gets people excited and engaged in this topic about the digital divide and how to connect Americans. My hope is that, I suspect we're all participating in this grand experiment right now, right, where large swaths of our economy are going online and people are working from home. And there's a lot of talk around that becoming the norm even after this pandemic. More people may be working from home now. More jobs may see that it's possible. I hope that we'll see a similar paradigm shift when it comes to the sort of receptivity and knowledge around telehealth services. Obviously, like I said, there's a lot of roadblocks in place toward closing the digital divide in America, but I think this could be an inflection point of sorts that sort of helps Americans understand the daily realities of those without broadband currently.
Thank you very much. Bob, we'll give you the last word, and then I'll say a couple things about our upcoming events.
Awesome. Thank you. And this has been a great panel. I want to thank everybody else on it because you've triggered such good thinking. I think, but I want to come back also to one of Craig's comments. I don't want us as a country to mistake short-term reactions and short-term fixes for long-term infrastructure building. And as we equip students with Wi-Fi hotspots or Chromebooks, that's not our long-term solution. And as we come out of the short-term crisis, let's all of us keep our eyes on the kind of infrastructure we want to be building. As James Fallow said, the quality of our infrastructure is a measure of the health of our community. And I want telehealth to be part of that, and it's certainly a driver. Drew?
Stand by.
I had this problem last time.
Well, like we said at the start, you got to lower your standards sometimes. Thank you for those comments. Stick around in the green room for a moment while I say a couple words about what we've got coming up. Next Wednesday, April 15th at 12 noon Eastern Time, we're going to be talking about infrastructure investment in a time of COVID-19, turning to governments, angels, or capital markets. We'll be talking in a future episode about measuring and monitoring the health of, as well as big data and high tech. Once again, thank you for joining and staying with us. I'm Drew Clark at broadbandbreakfast.com. You can subscribe on broadbandbreakfast.com for our weekly newsletter alerts that will also be informed about upcoming events. Thank you again to our panel. See you next week at 12 noon Eastern Time.